Welcome back. President Trump is ramping up his pressure campaign on Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, urging him to cut interest rates by a lot. The president's latest demand came in a handwritten letter held up by White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt at a press briefing yesterday. You see her there. Trump penned a message to Powell in Sharpie on a list of world central bank rates, writing in part, quote, "Jerome, you are, as usual, too late. You have cost the USA a fortune." The president has repeatedly attacked the Fed chair for resisting his demands to lower interest rates, recently encouraging Powell to resign and floating the idea of naming his replacement. Joining us now, senior economic reporter for Axios, Courtney Brown. So you've been reporting on this. This has been one twist of the dial after another between Powell and Trump here. The fact that they are now showing that letter, I think a lot of reporters have also received letters like that in Sharpie, written on newspaper articles that they've written and others in the past. So the fact that he's doing it to the Fed chair, celebrities are just like us, I guess. But what do you read into the way that they are now handling it from the White House podium?
In many ways, this is an old story because we saw the same tenor of attacks during Trump 1.0. But here's what's new. I think the first thing that's new is that this is a whole of administration approach. You have President Trump badgering Fed Chair Jerome Powell, Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, President Trump's top economist, Kevin Hassett, and even Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, to a certain extent, really hammering the Fed for not cutting interest rates. I mean, we know why the Fed is not cutting interest rates. Fed Chair Jerome Powell basically all but said last week that they would be cutting rates if not for the trade war that's created all of this uncertainty about whether or not inflation is going to be reignited. We haven't seen it so far, but the Fed is still in wait and see mode because they're so afraid about another inflation shock.
Another inflation shock. And yet, talk about why Trump is pressuring this so hard. What are the economic dominoes that he expects to fall if the Fed falls in line and says, OK, we'll cut rates by a lot, as he has said?
This is the other part that's new. The reason that President Trump wants the Fed to cut rates, the administration very much sees the Fed as playing a key role in keeping government interest costs low. And let me just say, that is not the Fed's job. That is like asking the tooth fairy to deliver Christmas presents. It's just not what the Fed does. It is, it's two things that don't mix. You never want to see a central bank making interest rate decisions for the sake of the government's expenses. This is a reality that would very much freak out Wall Street and global financial markets.
And so, given the reasoning for the Fed staying much more conservative in their goings-ons about rate cuts, then it brings us back to the trade war, which is still very much active. You're seeing ping pong balls go back and forth between Japan and the U.S., China and the U.S. Apparently that trade deal was signed very quietly. Talk about the latest here. We saw it with Canada earlier this week, the back and forth there. I mean, which of these mini trade wars should we be watching the most closely?
Essentially, we're meant to be having almost a Liberation Day 2.0 next week. That's when the 90-day pause on the first Liberation Day tariffs expires. It sounds like the administration is saying there will be some deals. Some countries will receive a letter essentially telling them what they will pay us to do business with the United States, which, if you remember that fateful day in April, that is exactly what happened. They put out a list of tariff rates. Financial markets freaked out. This time around, I think there is this idea among some of the folks I speak to on Wall Street that the president understands what happened a few months back, and there won't be a repeat. There will be threats of higher tariffs, but perhaps they won't come to pass. In the meantime, the economy is chugging along fine. If you look at the macroeconomic data, inflation data is at a 4-year low. That's pretty good. I think the big concern is what happens next, what happens as these tariffs kind of roll through the economy.
Yeah, and I think the question for some who might be looking at jobs reports, you mentioned during the break that we're getting it on Thursday, not the usual Friday because of the July 4th holiday.
Correct.
But at what point do you start seeing this market uncertainty, the chaos of the Trump tariffs that have the Fed and Wall Street so concerned, actually show up in the BLS reports and others?
This is the million-dollar question. The other thing I want to point out is that the stock market is at an all-time high. So all of this talk of uncertainty among traders, it very much seems like just talk. They're buying stocks. I mean, there are some warning signs with the U.S. dollar, for instance. There's some fears that global investors are not as giddy about owning U.S. assets like the U.S. dollar because of all of the policy uncertainty. But right now, it's so hard to look at the economy and say, there is this Trump-sized economic shock because the data just doesn't show it, at least not yet.
There might be an economic shock, but not a quantitative shock, at least not showing up yet. Senior economic reporter for Axios, Courtney Brown. Always love having you on. The Tooth Fairy. I didn't have her on my bingo card today. Thank you.